Hi, folks. Welcome to the Ignore the Machine broadcast. I'm Bradley J. Our guest is Rich Rubino, and we're going to talk about the primaries. The primaries are coming right up. And a couple things about the primaries. There's the Democratic Party switched the order of the Democratic primary. Why? What is the impact of that? What are the extrapolations from that? And what is the importance of the three early primaries, and why do some candidates focus on one of those states as opposed to the other? And we'll talk, I guess, a bit of strategy. So, Rich, how you doing?
Doing well, Bradley. Thank you so much for having me on again.
Okay, so first, when are these primaries?
The first is actually a caucus, and the difference between a caucus and a primary, essentially, voters go to the polls. They vote for and they have a Democratic primary, Republican primary. They vote, and then they're done. Caucuses are a lot different. In a caucus, you're essentially sitting there for 3 hours, about 3 hours. People give speeches for different local candidates. They actually, in Iowa, they have them both for midterm elections and general elections. And then one of the things they do is they have a presidential caucus. So essentially, you literally go and you stand over with which candidate you support. And if your candidate doesn't garner enough support in the first time, then candidates from other candidates, at least their supporters, try to get you over to that person. So theoretically, you could come in, say, I'm going to support candidate A. Candidate doesn't get enough support. You go over and you land up supporting candidate B as your second choice. So they're really kind of almost a primitive system, but they're very different than an actual primary.
And there are arguments the whole time, like people speaking, like come over to our side?
Absolutely. Someone gets up there and someone says, like, go back in 2004, for example, someone gets up there and talks for Dick Gephardt. Then someone goes up there and talks for Joe Lieberman. Then someone goes up there and talks for John Kerry. And they do this all over the state. There are 99 counties in Iowa. They do this all over the state. And somebody, for example, in 2004, a candidate like Dennis Kucinich might not get the cutoff point. So then candidates for Howard Dean would go over to Dennis Kucinich and say, well, Dennis Kucinich opposed the war in Iraq. So did Howard Dean. You should come over and you should support Howard Dean now because Dennis Kucinich doesn't garner enough support. Some people might say, no, I'm staying with Dennis Kucinich. Dennis Kucinich is my heart and soul. I'm a bread and butter Dennis Kucinich supporter. Others might say, well, I fought the good fight, but I think Howard Dean is better than just John Kerry at the end of the day. So there's really a lot of kind of swapping around. It's really kind of, it's really a lot. It's really kind of tailor made, if you will, for kind of political intrigue. In the Hampshire primary, it's a secret ballot. You go, you vote. That's it. And Iowa caucuses. First of all, the interesting thing about a caucus, you really have to be committed because think about it this way: it's Iowa, so you're in Ames, Iowa. In the middle of the winter, it could be 7 degrees below zero out, and you're going down to a local school or local community center to spend 3 hours, much of it listening to people listening sometimes to your neighbors talking about who should be, who we should nominate for the United States Congress, for example, and you're showing who you support. In the New Hampshire primary, this Australian ballot, secret ballot, you go and you vote for the person. No one has any idea who you vote for. In the Iowa caucuses, you're literally standing. So you go back in the 2020 election, you could be saying, okay, I'm going to stand here for Joe Biden. And then the guy right next to you is somebody who's going to be in the Amy Klobuchar camp. And that person might literally live right next door to you.
Huh. So which is a better system?
That is a great question. I will give you the pros and cons. I think the pros for the New Hampshire primary is that people can actually vote their conscience. You can vote your conscience because people have no idea who you're voting for. You could even tell people, you can even put a sign on your lawn, I'm going to vote for a certain candidate, but then when push comes to shove, your conscience says, no, I can't vote for that candidate. In a caucus, your boss could be right next to you. And if your boss says, I'm supporting Amy Klobuchar, you might come over and say, you know what, I was here for Joe Biden, but I really don't want to create any angst with my boss, so I'm going to go over and I'm going to support that candidate. So it's very hard, if you will, to kind of vote your conscience, especially when your neighbors are there. It almost reminds me a little bit of the New England town meeting. In New England town meeting, which is really a form of kind of pure Athenian democracy, you're going there and you're literally voting on proposals yourself, as opposed to what we do in a constitutional republic where you elect other people to do that. It's very similar.
Yep, we used to have town meetings in our town in New Hampshire. So what's the any other downsides? I mean, it seems to me that the secret ballot, there's a reason that there are so many secret ballots that most of our voting is secret ballot, is you get to vote your conscience without suffering repercussions for your vote.
Yes. Oh,
That seems to be a better thing to me. Is there any upside to it?
the other upside, I think, to a caucus. Well, I guess one of the upside is how your neighbors are necessarily going to vote. But you know what though? I think that's also a downside, because if you look at how many people actually show up, it's very few people that actually are willing to brave a cold day in January to go and vote. And sometimes younger people specifically will say they're going to go vote, and then they actually don't. And this is what we saw back in 2004. Everyone thinks of 2004. What's the first thing you think of at the Howard Dean campaign when he goes, and we're going to Michigan and North Dakota and South Dakota, and then we're going to Washington, D.C. to take back the White House? Yeah. But remember when he actually gave that speech, he had just come in fourth place in Iowa. John Kerry won with 38% of the vote. John Edwards, who was an afterthought, really kind of proliferated toward the end of the campaign. James Carville said he's better than Bill Clinton on the stump. Comes in second place. Dick Gephardt third. Howard Dean comes in fourth place. But Howard Dean had been an early front runner. Part of it was he was very much, a lot of his support was based in upper educated college students specifically. Okay, so a lot of those college students said that they were for Howard Dean, but at the end of the day, a lot of them did not actually come out to the caucuses to vote for Howard Dean. So the polls were kind of magnified in terms of how Howard Dean was actually supposed to do. So Howard Dean was supposed to win. Now, there were other factors too. One of them was that Howard Dean and Dick Gephardt absolutely excoriated each other, and Iowa voters on the Democratic and Republican side, respectively, are known for being more polite and shunning negative campaigning. So they saw that, and as a result, there was a mass exodus from both Howard Dean and Dick Gephardt, and that's why John Kerry and John Edwards rose to the top. But that is something that you see sometimes in Iowa, is older voters are more likely to come out, and in that case, older voters were more likely to support a candidate like John Kerry. And also in rural parts of the state, someone like John Edwards, his whole theme was being a small town boy, being somebody whose father was, he said, worked in a mill all his life. So he did very well in the rural areas, and rural older voters specifically are kind of tailor-made for him, because they were the ones who tended to come out.
Wow. Okay, so New Hampshire primary, not the first anymore, correct?
Well, no, not necessarily. In the Republican side, they're going with what they always do. New Hampshire's first. On the Democratic side, this is where it gets really Byzantine, okay? I'll try to explain this as easily as I possibly can. So the New Hampshire Democratic Party, and Joe Biden supported this. Jamie Harrison, who heads the Democratic Party, before that, he was a South Carolinian. He was the person who lost to Lindsey Graham in the United States Senate race. So there was a proposal that South Carolina come before Iowa and New Hampshire. Normally, it goes Iowa, New Hampshire. So Iowa comes first, the caucuses. Then you go to New Hampshire. Then you go to South Carolina. Joe Biden, the last election, lost New Hampshire and lost Iowa. His tailor-made constituency was South Carolina.
All right.
African-American voters specifically gravitate toward Joe Biden. Jim Clyburn, the minority whip from the House of Representatives, endorsed him. He wins South Carolina, goes on to win the nomination. So South Carolina saved him last time. South Carolina Democratic voters are overwhelmingly, it's about 56%, for example, are African-American. So accordingly, he wants to reward them by putting South Carolina first. And also, remember last time, the Iowa caucuses, remember what happened. Pete Buttigieg barely won the Iowa caucuses, but only after a protracted process of trying to actually count the votes. They kind of embarrassed themselves, if you will. But New Hampshire has a law, and the law says New Hampshire will always schedule their primary for both major parties prior to any other party's primary. So they could theoretically still have their primaries without Joe Biden on the ballot. Joe Biden would not put his name on the ballot unless New Hampshire is later on. Now, theoretically, someone, I guess, could get signatures and put his name on the ballot. But there will be potentially ramifications for a candidate who actually wins the New Hampshire primary, meaning that they're not going to get the actual delegates. Now, out of 100% of the delegates, New Hampshire primary delegates are like 1%. It's almost infinitesimal how much this does not matter. It's non-consequential. It's de minimis, if you will. But if somebody like Marianne Williamson or Robert Kennedy Jr. or Dean Phillips, the congressman from Minnesota, who's seriously considering challenging Joe Biden, if they were to do extremely well in the New Hampshire primary, they are going to garner a lot of media attention. And the story the next day, despite the fact that the delegates are not going to be rewarded, is going to be, look how weak Joe Biden is. Why did one of these candidates do so well in the New Hampshire primary? So it's more of a moral type of a thing. It's more of a about morale of that candidate than it is about the actual quantifying, actually garnering those very few delegates in New Hampshire actually musters.
So Joe Biden wants to go first because he does better in Carolina, and everybody wants to come out of the gate with a win.
Yeah, and I think, by the way, presidential candidates generally win. Incumbent presidents generally will win Iowa and New Hampshire. There have been precedents. Even Harry Truman was the last Democratic incumbent president who actually lost the New Hampshire primary. He lost to Estes Kefauver, senator from Tennessee. Truman was extremely unpopular because the Korean War kept going on. There was corruption in the underlings of his administration, and the fact that the fact that the communists had taken over mainland China, people blamed it on Truman. Truman was very unpopular. He loses the New Hampshire primary. Then he essentially says, I'm not going to run for president. He hadn't officially declared his presidential race. But generally speaking, if there's an incumbent president, that president will win the Iowa caucuses and will win the New Hampshire primary. What Joe Biden does not want to have, I think, not that he would necessarily lose, but if an opponent garners 30% of the vote, for example, then the next day the story is going to be, why is 30% of the Democratic Party not supporting an incumbent president? And that could do a lot to decrease morale in Joe Biden's camp, and potentially benefactors might say, you know what, we really need to find somebody else to compete in future primaries.
So what's Joe Biden going to do? Would he actually not put his name on the ballot in New Hampshire? That would be nuts.
Yes, because he said theoretically he could, and New Hampshire won't actually have any actual delegates, or they could put his name on the ballot, but it wouldn't necessarily even matter. Lyndon Johnson in 1968, Lyndon Johnson's name was not on the ballot. He won 48%. He was a write-in candidate, and he won 48% of the vote. But the next day, the story was that a senator from Minnesota named Eugene McCarthy had won 42.4% of the vote. His name was actually on the ballot. He actually spent an inordinate amount of time campaigning in New Hampshire. He had supporters, former hippies, going clean for jeans, shaving their beards, getting rid of their long hair, extricating it, and going around campaigning. And Lyndon Johnson, a few days later, dropped out of the race and said, I shall not seek and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president, in a Texas accent.
So did the hippies actually extricated their hair?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. They had to. If you're going to Berlin,
where do you go to do that? Do you go to a hair extricator?
If you're going, I guess you do. If you're going to Berlin, New Hampshire, and you're talking to an older union member who works in a paper mill, and you're going and you look like you're not from New Hampshire, they're not going to take you seriously. On the other hand, if you're very polite and you look like the kid next door, they might take you seriously as an 18-year-old, but they all went over to New Hampshire. It was a children's crusade, if you will. It's an absolutely fascinating story. So Lyndon Johnson, his prosecution of the Vietnam War became very unpopular among young voters, specifically of draft age. So they all galvanized. They were looking for a candidate to challenge him in the primary. They went to Senator Metcalf from Montana. Senator Metcalf says no. They went to Robert Kennedy from New York. Robert Kennedy says no. So they went to Eugene McCarthy as kind of a last-ditch effort. Eugene McCarthy had opposed the Vietnam War, but he was a quiet senator. His office was called the Office of Sleepy Hollow because he was known for being lackadaisical and sometimes missing votes or spending a lot of time just hanging out in his office. But Eugene McCarthy says, all right, I'm going to do it. And he runs, and all these people galvanize toward him because his message is essentially the United States needs to extricate themselves from Vietnam. Eugene McCarthy lands up winning 42% of the vote. A few days right after that, Lyndon Johnson drops out of the race.
So what's the scheduled order now? Iowa, South Carolina, New Hampshire?
In the Republican primary, it's going to be Iowa first, caucuses.
Then Democrat. I should have specified Democrat.
Okay, in the Democratic primary, it's going to be South Carolina first.
Oh, wow.
South Carolina is going to be the first primary. Then they're going to have others. They're going to go to Michigan. Georgia's going to be very early. Eventually, you're going to have New Hampshire, and eventually, you're going to have Iowa. But Iowa's going to be essentially later in the process, and it's going to be almost meaningless.
So do these others change that are going to come before New Hampshire as well? How did they get before New Hampshire? I thought only South Carolina was jumping ahead, but all these other states are jumping ahead too.
It's
in the
it's a whole process that the Democratic Party has approved.
Oh.
There's been opposition, and this is a really weird instance. You have Ray Buckley, who's the chairman of the Democratic Party in New Hampshire, having to take on the incumbent president. Usually, you're supposed to essentially give plaudits, genuflect, and talk about how your president is essentially the best thing since Gandhi. But this time, you have to say, well, this president really made a mistake, so it's really kind of an embarrassing and an unenviable position, if you will, to be making this argument that New Hampshire essentially has to stay first. And also, you're making this argument, and nationally, I think some Democrats will say, well, your state is overwhelmingly monolithic. Your state is overwhelmingly white, for example. Why not give a state that's more representative of the American people and of where the Democratic Party is than a state that is so monolithic like New Hampshire? And
so is New Hampshire going to change it and put their date out front?
Yes, and the Secretary of State has said that they have a law in New Hampshire. It's a state law that they have to hold their primaries before any other state. So they could hold it, but then the National Democratic Party says, okay, you held it, but it's null and void because it doesn't mean anything. So when you actually go to the convention in 2024, there's not going to be, they could theoretically, there could not even be New Hampshire delegates. They could penalize them that way, but those numbers that they get, there's not going to be any numbers. It's going to be essentially what you call a beauty contest.
Except if Joe Biden wins, they're going to want to count them.
But they've already made their point. In New Hampshire, it's so small anyways, and the chances of Joe Biden losing are astronomically low. It's really a matter of, I think most people would say it's really a matter of how much Joe Biden wins by. So they can essentially, he can, what happens in New Hampshire is just so irrelevant numerically, because you compare New Hampshire to Texas, California, New York, Florida, New Jersey, some of the larger states. New Hampshire is really kind of inconsequential. So I don't think he's really necessarily fretting about New Hampshire delegates.
Okay, so candidate Biden wants this. This addresses the second part of our thing: why certain candidates spend time and care more about certain states. Joe Biden cares about South Carolina because he does well. Is that why? What motivates the others as well, or are there other things?
I think every candidate focus on it's really a matter of micro targeting constituencies. Iowa, for example, in the Republican Party, if you're kind of a libertarian, if you're somebody who focuses on fiscal issues to the extent to the detriment of social issues, you're more of a New Hampshire candidate. Okay, for example, in 2008, for example, Mike Huckabee, the former governor of Arkansas, he's an evangelical Christian. He focused on Iowa. And he was a very minor candidate at the beginning. He was at 3-4% of the polls. But he focused on Iowa because he knows that there are a lot of rural voters and there are a lot of evangelical fundamentalist Christians. He campaigned in that constituency, and he lands up winning the Iowa caucuses. Surprised everybody. 4 years later, 2012, Rick Santorum, the former senator from Pennsylvania, he focuses on Iowa, and he focuses on evangelical voters, and he does well. He wins the Iowa caucus just barely with evangelical voters. Ted Cruz in 2016, he focused on evangelical voters. That was a tailor-made constituency for him. And what happened? He won with evangelical voters. Candidates like a Steve Forbes or a Mitt Romney, who are not necessarily, who while they are social conservatives, are not necessarily associated with social conservatism, do not necessarily do well there in the state of Iowa. In the state of New Hampshire is arguably the most secular state in the country. Even in the Republican primary, there are very few actual evangelical voters that emphasize social issues. For example, even the governor of New Hampshire is very much of a fiscal conservative, but kind of a social moderate. Social conservatives, with very few exceptions like former Senator Bob Smith, generally do not get elected statewide in New Hampshire. The state's got a Democratic governor, it's got 2 Democratic senators and 2 Democratic members of the House of Representatives with a kind of moderate Republican governor. So who does well in a state like New Hampshire? Well, somebody who's more libertarian or somebody who is more moderate in the Republican primary is likely to do relatively well in New Hampshire. Or somebody who is from a neighboring state. And the reason I say this is because this often happens. Ed Muskie was from Maine. Ed Muskie wins the New Hampshire primary. But the next day, the story is not necessarily that he won the New Hampshire primary. It's that George McGovern did very well. George McGovern was a senator from South Dakota. People said, well, he's just, well, you know what? The senator's from, you know what? Ed Muskie's almost a third senator. He comes from the neighboring state. He has name recognition. It's not fair. So the focus is on who comes in second place. Now, in 1988, Michael Dukakis won New Hampshire, but lots of the focus the next day was, well, Dick Gephardt, who had won the Iowa caucuses, who was kind of a rural type Democrat, even though he came from an urban district. He comes in second. That's the next day story. And the most fascinating one was 1992. Paul Tsongas was from Massachusetts, a former senator. He wins 35% of the vote. That's part of the story the next day. But Bill Clinton, after the Jennifer Flowers issue, after the draft issue, he comes in second place at 26%. So next day, Bill Clinton that night just says, and I would like to declare that I'm the comeback kid. Bill Clinton is the comeback. New Hampshire made me the comeback kid. So the next day, the story is, well, Paul Tsongas, he comes from a neighboring state. Of course he's going to do well there. But Bill Clinton, Southern governor, from the outer South, wins 26% of the vote. And you know what? That's really the story. So if you come from a neighboring state and you win New Hampshire, it's not really that much of a victory. It's more, well, yeah, of course you're going to win.
2 questions before we are done. One, did I see Chris Sununu not running for president? Not even running for governor?
Yes.
Is he not running for governor? He's
That's
retiring
correct.
Or something?
That's correct. A lot of people thought last time around, and this was conventional wisdom, conventional belief, if you will, that he was not going to run for re-election. He was going to challenge Maggie Hassan to the United States Senate. He chose not to do that. Instead, ran into the Republican primary, had a formidable challenge in the primary, won, and then lands up winning in the general election. New Hampshire, by the way, and Vermont are the only states in the country which continue to have 2-year terms as opposed to 4-year terms. So every 2 years, and there's no term limits, every 2 years there is an election for governor. Now, as soon as he won the governorship last time, he started laying the spade work for his own presidential candidacy, which would have really been interesting because you would have usually the governor of the home state, usually is kind of a referee in their own party's primary. There's somebody that every candidate genuflects to. This would have been interesting if he was actually a candidate, the way, for example, Tom Harkin was in 1992, and as a result, every other candidate basically just about stayed out of Iowa. He probably saw polls, and the polls showed that he wasn't going to win the New Hampshire primary. Donald Trump was. DeSantis would come in second. He'd come in third. So he saw the handwriting on the wall, if you will, and he decided not to run for president. Now, why he's not running for re-election, I don't know. Maybe he's looking for potentially a job in another Republican administration or going back to the private sector. But I think
he's not that old.
No, not at all. He has a future ahead of him. And the other thing, potentially, Senator Shaheen, she could potentially not run for re-election in 2026, in which case Chris Sununu would probably be the preponderant front runner for that race. But he obviously looked at it and he decided not to run against Maggie Hassan this time around. If he did that, that would have probably been the one of the main races and probably one of the main chances for the Republicans to have a pickup because he's relatively popular in the Granite State.
So besides, I guess, having the name senator before your name instead of governor is a bigger deal and people want to do it.
I don't think so.
For the ego, isn't being a senator a cush job compared to actually running a state? Running a state's hard, lots of nuts and bolts. Being a senator seems pretty easy, very political. You kiss that butt here, kiss that butt, get some favors. It seems like a political chess game, but it doesn't seem like such a mechanical grind.
That is absolutely true. A United States senator, there are 100 United States senators, and you can very much you can very much do as little or as much work as you want to. You essentially show up for votes. Many of them are inconsequential. You don't necessarily have to show up for votes. You can spend your time running for president if you want to. A governor essentially you're working with the state legislature, you're trying to get legislation passed, you're deciding what you're going to veto, what you're going to sign. If there's a crisis, you have to be there to manage the crisis, which is why we tend to elect governors for president and not United States senators. There's only been 3 incumbent United States senators who have gone directly to the presidency: Warren G. Harding, 1920, John F. Kennedy, 1960, and Barack Obama in 2008. There are litanies of people who have tried, who are United States senators, who were not able to come off as kind of leaders. They look at their records and they'll say, well, you know, I voted for House Resolution 737, the Agriculture Appropriations Bill. You get to this point where you kind of talk in Senatese.
Right, but I could do that. Anybody could do that.
Oh yeah, you can vote. I mean, you really and people stay in the Senate for the way, you know, Strom Thurmond, Robert Byrd, Mitch McConnell, Dan Stein. You can stay in the Senate for a long period of time, and I mean, you can even lead the United States Senate, but you're not necessarily seen as a leader. Governors, on the other hand, if there's a crisis, the governor is essentially there. Calvin Coolidge, when he was governor of Massachusetts, he led the state during the police strike. As a result, 1920, he wins the Republican vice presidential nomination because people looked at that and they said, you know, that is really leadership. Chris Christie, when he was governor of New Jersey, his first term, because of the way he was kind of confrontational with his opponents, if you will, he became very popular, even though he'd just been elected. And many Republicans, like Rush Limbaugh, the talk show host, wanted him to run for president. I think Bill Clinton was probably the quintessential candidate who, I think that the fact that he was a small state governor, the only 2 small state governors have won the presidency, Franklin Pierce in 1852, Bill Clinton in 1992. But he was somebody who could, this is what he could do. He could say, you know what, I've been elected and I've led a state that is relatively conservative, and I've been elected 5 times. I was elected attorney general. I was elected governor in 1978, 1982, 1986, 1990. If I can get elected governor in a state like this, and people see me every day in a relatively conservative state that George H.W. Bush won handily in 1988, I can be the candidate for president in 1992, and I can beat Bush in the general election. Paul Tsongas, on the other hand, former United States senator from Massachusetts, he would have that Massachusetts label. Also, he would have the label of being a United States senator versus somebody who has actually led a state. And that's why we tend to elect governors. If you look at just recently, certainly Jimmy Carter, Ronald Reagan, George W. Bush, Bill Clinton, and United States senators. I say only 3 of them have gone directly from the United States Senate to the presidency.
I see. We have a question from Phil Kate, who I believe is in New Hampshire, Keene, probably. Wow. You see the question there. Will Sununu be VP candidate or VP? Would be on a ticket?
I can't envisage that scenario. I don't see where. First of all, because I think that the abortion issue is basically a persona non grata if you support abortion rights in any form right now in the Republican Party. If you do that, then if a Republican candidate were to choose a vice presidential running mate who is not opposed categorically to abortion rights, then there would probably be a mass exodus. Some Republicans, some social conservatives would start a movement to stay home or vote for a third-party candidate, something to that effect. And just frankly, the fact that he doesn't represent where the Republican Party is right now. They're not based in the Northeast. They're based in the West. And I think, respectively, they're based in the South. Now, that being said, if he were to, which is not going to happen, if he were to be chosen as their vice presidential running mate, he would be somebody who would be able to appeal, I think, to some of those very elusive actual independent voters. But certainly also, if Donald Trump is the Republican nominee, he's not going to choose somebody, I think, who's been as critical of him as Governor Sununu is. And he doesn't have the regional appeal, and he does not have the appeal of, for example, being a woman or a minority or something else, so potentially add something to the ticket. So I don't see how that would. I don't see that happening. I think it'd be almost a suicide mission for a Republican to choose a pro-choice running mate.
Also, if he was chosen, on the outside chance he was chosen, would he do it? If you do that, you're kind of crossing the Rubicon.
Yeah.
And maybe it would taint him for stuff he wants to do in the future, like be a New Hampshire senator.
Yeah, well, it reminds me of 1956 when Adlai Stevenson was the Democratic presidential nominee, and the last time anyone did this, he threw the convention to the delegates. He said, "I'm not going to choose my vice presidential running mate Other people you can nominate whoever you want, and whoever wins. So Lyndon Johnson nominates John F. Kennedy for the nomination, and John F. Kennedy loses to Estes Kefauver. But his father was very much wanted him to lose that election. He said, if you're everyone knows Stevenson's going to lose. You're associated with Stevenson. People are going to use you as a scapegoat. They're going to blame you. In the case of Sununu, you're right. If he becomes Trump, I do think if he was ever given the idea of given the chance of being a running mate, I think he would take it. But let's say he becomes Trump's running mate, then Trump is not necessarily somebody who's popular in the state of New Hampshire. Then he tries to run for himself, the United States Senate seat in 2026 after losing with Trump. He's immediately associated with Donald Trump, and he tries to disassociate himself. And this is fascinating because, on the one hand, if you cannot disassociate yourself completely with him, because a lot of the people who are giving the money to Republican candidates in the state of New Hampshire, a lot of those benefactors are going to close their checkbook and say he wasn't with us in 2024. But on the other hand, if you don't disassociate yourself and you say, yep, I'm going to essentially tether and allegate myself to Donald Trump, then people who are in the center, New Hampshire is basically a centrist state. That state, by the way, that Joe Biden won last time around, those people are going to say, well, he's just essentially a Trump clone. I'm going to vote for the Democrats. So it's really a no-win situation, but it's not something I think Sununu has to worry about anyway.
I don't feel like he would say yes. I feel like he would say, no, thanks. Let's go. That's just me.
Trump, maybe.
What about Kelly Ayotte?
Yeah, well, she's a former United States senator. When she was in the United States Senate, she was somebody who associated herself as a hawk on foreign policy. When Joe Lieberman retired, she took over the role with Lindsey Graham and John McCain as kind of the three amigos, the three hawks, if you will, in the Republican Party. That was basically what she was known for. Then she loses her re-election to Maggie Hassan by literally about 1,071 votes. That's all she lost, by one of the closest elections in New Hampshire history. So she still has some name recognition. In terms of running for the United States Senate, she has an interesting strategy which may work in the New Hampshire primary. Says we should not become Massachusetts. She's basically saying, she's making this a separation, if you will, between New Hampshire and Massachusetts, and say that if we elect a Democrat, if we elect a Democrat as governor, then they're gonna make the state into Massachusetts. New Hampshire is known for a state that does not have an income tax, for example. They do have a property tax, which can be very debilitating, but they do not have an income tax. And there have been proposals by some in the Democratic legislature to have there to be an income tax. I don't think it's actually going to happen. But she's basically saying, I'm going to keep New Hampshire, and she knows that a lot of people who live specifically in very southern regiments of New Hampshire are people who are refugees, if you will, from Massachusetts. Now, if she gets into the general election, there are a lot of people also who have very positive feelings about Massachusetts who may not, and she may kind of have to walk that back a little bit.
Okay, excuse me. All right, thank you very much. Rich Rubino, remind people about your book.
The Great American Political Trivia Challenge, Political Trivia on Steroids.
It is awesome. And Christmas is rolling right up. You might want to get your order in.
Christmas in August.
And I would ask anybody to please go to my Bradley J. Travel channel. There's going to be a spectacular Old City of Jerusalem video coming out. It's 16 minutes long. It's a big. I actually watched it 6 times last night, and it's 16 minutes long. 6 times in a row. It's long for social media videos, but if you do watch it, you'll get a true idea of what it's really like in the most historical square mile on planet Earth. So there you go. I think this is our best one ever, Rich.
Awesome.
I think everyone should send it to the cable networks, because Rich deserves to be on them, the big fancy ones. All right. I'll talk to you soon, brother.
Thank you. Will do.
Oh, wait a minute. Trivia question.
Oh.
Where Jeeps called Jeeps? I think initially it was an acronym, like General something something something.
It's a Jeep thing.
I know it's G, not J. I give up, Phil, Kate. What's the reason? What's the answer? Good question. Very cool. I think I knew this one time. Hurry up, Phil. Come on. What's the answer? Trivia question. Why are Jeeps? Anybody, actually. Why are Jeeps called Jeeps? Or in other ways, how did they get that name? I don't know. We can't sit around and wait for the answer. So I'm going to say goodbye, and we'll all have to look up why Jeeps are called Jeeps.
Everyone's got a Wikipedia now.
On our own. Thanks very much. Rich
you.
Rubino. Oh, the name comes from general purpose Jeep. Yeah. So I was on the right track. Hopefully, I get a little bit of warm feeling for. I did say the word general purpose Jeep.
Do you know
Very
where the
good.
word snafu comes from? What that stands for?
Snafu is kind of like foo bar,
I think it's situation normal, all fouled up.
fouled. Okay. Okay. Very good. Take care.
Thank you so much.
All right. End broadcast.